Hi everyone, it's Mr. Sinti, and today I get to talk to you about conservation biology. Conservation biology is becoming so important these days that it's sort of developed its own discipline. Although I'm going to consider it under the umbrella of ecology, it really stands alone because of its importance, and it's been emerging over the years, and now it's becoming one of the most important branches of biology. And let's get into that conversation. Like, why would something called conservation biology become so important? Well, the word itself means to conserve or to protect the diversity, the biodiversity that we have here on the planet Earth. Because as it turns out, we're in a little bit of a crisis here. There's a biodiversity crisis, and we're experiencing a rapid decline in biodiversity on the Earth. And not to say that this hasn't happened before in time. You know, life has been on the Earth for about 3.5 billion years. And so we've seen extinction before. We know that it occurs from the fossil record, but it's occurring this time in a really rapid event. And the reason being is that it has to do with one species in particular, and that's humans. It seems that humans are being the cause of this rapid extinction. And so if we're the cause of it, we have to take responsibility to sort of, stop that. And so biodiversity can be studied on three different basic levels. And so one of the levels, the largest level, is what you'd call community and ecosystem diversity. So in other words, you want to protect like a redwood forest, because by protecting the redwood forest, you're really protecting all of the organisms that are living inside of that forest. You can also protect the tropical rainforest. You can protect the chaparral. You could protect the coral reefs of the world in the ocean. And so these are particular areas of hotspots that are crucial because there's a lot of species diversity and they're essential. So you could go at it that way, or you could look at protecting individual species. And so the species diversity is rather important too. So you could try to save the redwood, protect the redwood squirrel, the fern, or the frogs, banana slugs. You could look at species, protecting them individually. Okay, and that's important too. Or you could look at within a species, like for example, within the vole population, genetically, there's diversity there. And so the greater the diversity within the population, the better the whole species is going to be doing. Because again, genetic diversity is rather important in terms of survival to withstand sort of threats to the species in terms of, like, for example, disease is an example of one of those. And so, why would we care about protecting biodiversity? Well, I mean, if you turn it upon ourselves and make it sort of human centric, it our own welfare is dependent on biodiversity. And so, I mean, it's worthwhile to protect in and of itself, but I'll just turn it into human centric for a second. So, for economic reasons, we want to protect biodiversity. Like, for example, just having a lot of birds and insects and a diversity of that will help to reduce, birds help to reduce pests that are attacking our crops. And so birds alone save farmers millions of dollars that would be otherwise lost to insects. And so for economic reasons, we need to protect biodiversity. I mean, this is really, on a large scale, this is really important to some countries. Like, for example, I'll just throw it out, Costa Rica in Central America. It's really economically important for them to maintain their tropical rainforest for ecotourism. So it's valuable to not disrupt those ecosystems. And then this is a huge one for medical purposes. We get a lot of our pharmaceuticals and therapeuticals from plants. And so it's very difficult to come up with these medicines in and of themselves. And so we could sort of discover, either by design or serendipitously, we could discover some important drugs that could fight off, for example, cancer. And a good example of that is something called taxol. And taxol came from isolating this really interesting ring structure from the Pacific yew tree. And so as it turns out that is a really important medicine for fighting off cancer, and it's important for like ovarian, breast cancer, lung cancer, and prostate cancer. And so it's really critical. If we lose trees, we could possibly lose cures for future diseases and ones that are with us. And so we're really curious about this. And so if you don't mind me indulging a little bit on something personal, but I have the privilege and fortune to be able to teach a class on conservation biology, but it's really a biotechnology class in disguise, because instead of just going over the principles of conservation biology, we're out there doing it. We're out there protecting species. And what we're looking at is we're studying genetic diversity, and we're studying it within the population of coastal redwood trees. And so, again, what we're doing is we're isolating DNA from these trees, we're crushing down the needles, and we're analyzing to see how genetically similar members are in a particular grove. Because the more diverse, we're thinking the better that population will be in order to survive climate change or an invasive species or disease. So we're studying these populations of redwood trees. And so the loss of the genetic diversity of the tree is important, not only to protect the redwood, but again, the redwood's sort of like an umbrella. It protects everything within it. So you save the redwood tree, you really save the entire community. So it's extremely important. So I'm fortunate to be able to be researching in this area. And so the loss of species diversity is really important. Again, not only just to the redwood trees, but it's important for all species to be preserved. And so the United States has actually entered into this conversation. They've come up with the Endangered Species Act. I'm not sure if you've heard of it before, but maybe you have. And so we can start to classify organisms based on their number as either being endangered, in other words, close to going extinct, or threatened, meaning likely to become endangered in the foreseeable future. And so if you look up a particular organism on Wikipedia, it'll actually give you their status in terms of if they're threatened or if they're endangered or if they're doing okay. It's kind of interesting. Just an example locally, I mean, this is the California grizzly bear, and you're like, wait a minute, California grizzly bear? I didn't know there were grizzly bears in California. There used to be. They're extinct in California. Fortunately, they're not extinct. The population in California is extinct, but they're not worldwide extinct, fortunately. But the California one is. And so, I mean, you might say, well, this is good because you have to consider, the human issues involved. And so obviously the grizzly bear would be a threat to human population. But overall, I think it's really a sad state when the California flag is actually flying the grizzly bear and it's extinct. When I look at the California flag, to me, it's a flag telling me to step up. It's telling me it's a reminder of the tragedy of the bear. And so, did you think about that when you see the bear flying in the flag, that it's really extinct? Not all bears in California are extinct. Like, for example, the Ursus americanus, as opposed to the Ursus horribilis, not horrible, mispronouncing that. The black bear, it's kind of misleading because some of them are black, but some of them can be brown, and some of them are even blonde or cinnamon color. But there's a picture of the black bear in Sequoia National Park. And so the loss of ecosystem diversity is a reason to protect biodiversity as well. And so again, if you protect one species like the redwood, or if you protect something like a palm tree in the tropical rainforest, it can really affect the entire community because it could be a keystone species, which means that a lot of other species depend on it. And so it's rather critical for maintaining species diversity in general. And so the tropical rainforest is extremely critical. It must be protected, and it's being obliterated. And it still continues to occur. It's brutal. And so how do we know what's going on in ecosystems? It's really difficult to study. Just want to point this out. There's these structures in Arizona in the United States called biosphere. And what these structures, they sort of look futuristic, but inside of them there are forests, there's little oceans in here, there's little biomes inside. And so scientists come here and they do research in a controlled environment, meaning that it's closed off, and so they can measure things like temperature and levels of atmospheric carbon dioxide and oxygen. And so we're trying to understand the balance between organisms. It's difficult to do it. And so one of the interesting studies that is happening inside the biosphere is in the ocean biome. So this section over here is the ocean. And so, as you may know, the carbon dioxide is rising in the atmosphere as a result of humans increasing use of fossil fuels, and combustion produces a lot of carbon dioxide. And so that's increasing into the atmosphere. Most people, when they talk about increased carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, talk about the effect that that has on climate. In other words, it's warming the planet. The more carbon dioxide, because it provides insulation to the energy produced from the sun when it comes in. And so it's something called the greenhouse effect. But people sometimes forget the fact that carbon dioxide can be absorbed in the water. And when it's absorbed in the water, it reacts with water. So carbon dioxide goes in the water, and water holds quite a lot. And it forms something called carbonic acid, and then ultimately bicarbonate ion. But what it does is it increases the acidity in the ocean. And so a lot of it is carbon dioxide is taken up by trees for photosynthesis and also phytoplankton. But the thing is, if humans are cutting down and deforesting trees, that's going to reduce the tree's ability to remove it from the atmosphere. And then also it's being absorbed by the ocean. And so all of our cars are producing this. And so it's increasing the acidity of the ocean. And so here's the reaction, in case you're interested in that. It's carbon dioxide and water produces carbonic acid. It's a weak acid, truthfully. But nevertheless, it then dissociates into bicarbonate ion and then H+, which is what increases the acidity. And so what happens is it's lowering the pH. And what's happening is the most sensitive to this are the coral reef animals. And these coral reef animals, it interferes with their ability to absorb calcium from the water and construct their shells, which protect them. And so it's basically eroding. If you had, for example, if you were to do this at home, if you were to have a piece of chalk, which is a lot of calcium, try pouring some vinegar, which is acetic acid. Try pouring that onto the chalk. What it's going to do is dissolve it. And so that's what's happening to the coral reef. The acid is literally dissolving the coral reef. We can't have it. We can't have that happening. And so what's interesting is to determine the effects of this is inside the biosphere. They call it Biosphere 2 because there was a Biosphere 1 and then a Biosphere 2. So here's this ocean. And so there's a scientist studying this from Columbia University who's trying to analyze the effects of the acid that's occurring inside the ocean and how it's affecting the coral. And so that's kind of interesting. And then just to add a little relevance to this, and we have an advanced placement biology question coming at us in the year 2012, and it's literally asking what we're talking about right now is how increased carbon dioxide in the atmosphere results in greater acidification of the ocean. So again, that's producing carbonic acid and then bicarbonate, increasing the hydrogen ion. And the effect in the marine organisms, again, it's hurting the coral reef because they're not able to produce. And so as a result, human activity, how can two examples of human activity that can increase carbon dioxide? And that's, of course, burning fossil fuels and combustion, and also the logging and deforestation is indirectly raising it because the trees are the ones that are removing it. So I want to talk to you about the threats to biodiversity. And so you're like, well, what's going on with the HIPPO? To remember this, sometimes we need little acronyms to help us, little memory hints to sort of remember things so we can carry this along with us forever. And so if you're going to get into a conversation about declining species diversity, and you're like, hey, I recall it had something to do with HIPPO. And HIPPO stands for habitat destruction, which is the H, habitat destruction. And then it's I for introduced species, P for pollution, and another P for population. This would be human population. And then O would be overexploitation. And so this is one way to remember this. And it's also kind of in the order of importance as well. And so habitat destruction, I mean, this may seem obvious, but when humans alter the habitat, and I know we like places like resorts, like for example in Las Vegas, and we create this, what's happening is we're removing the normal habitat that all of the organisms are living in. And so when you do that, you lower the carrying capacity, and then organisms are going to be competing, and the loss of some organisms can affect the others as well. And so habitat destruction, it's as we increase in numbers, we take more of the world's habitat away. And so we've even noticed, like for example in the Sierras, the Sierra Nevada, we've seen declines in all kinds of populations, in particularly in the birds. And why is that? Because of grazing land that we use, and so that's a habitat destruction for logging of trees, and also fire suppression. And you're like, wait a minute, fire suppression? Yeah, because that's habitat destruction, because ultimately it's not allowing that particular forest to be able to thrive in the future, and therefore that affects the habitat. And then just sheer development. As we expand and move outward, we're destroying the habitat. And so this is a very sad picture of giant sequoia trees that have been cut down. And so this is what we're getting at in terms of habitat destruction. So, we're fortunate that we have some areas that are fairly pristine. I say fairly, meaning that we have these beautiful parks like Yosemite National Park. And it's like, well, wow, look at all the species diversity there, 250 different species. All sorts of things are living in there. And so it's sort of a really great triumph of biodiversity. And why? Because the habitat has been pretty much preserved. I mean, you could debate this in terms of the development that we see in Yosemite Valley, in terms of also the visitors that are coming are literally trampling the park to death. They're almost like loving it to death. But if you were to compare, it's still looking good. If you were to compare the species diversity within the park boundaries to just right outside, and there's a big contrast, and that's because of habitat destruction. And so an example of this is the fact that the spotted owl, so human population continues to expand, but luckily the wildlife refuge in the national parks are saving these species like the spotted owl. And again, the spotted owl gets a lot of attention, and people scoff at it. Has anyone even seen a spotted owl? Who cares? Well, again, it's a keystone species. I might bring that up again. It's a predator, and so therefore it maintains the balance in the food web, and it actually encourages species diversity. So it's not really trivial. And so next on the list is introduced species. Now, introduced species, there's so many examples of this. Even here in the Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area, it's a place where there's lots of ships that come in because it's a port where there's a lot of trade going on. And so these ships are also bringing in lots of introduced species indirectly by taking in water from where they came, and then releasing that water when they come into San Francisco Bay. So there's all kinds of things coming into the bay, which is reducing species diversity. But how do you like this example? Would you believe there was once upon a time in Yosemite there wasn't a lot of visitors, and so it was thought by the Park Service to increase visitation. People are into fishing, so they thought that they would actually fly over the mountain lakes, the High Sierra lakes, with helicopters and literally inoculate these lakes, drop in fish. And so they introduced trout to these to these lakes, and you're like, wow, that'll be great. People love to come up there and fish. But as a consequence, as it turns out, the trout that's up there, may have been attractive to tourists, but what they're doing is they're eating the frog tadpoles. And so what we see is a dramatic loss of native frogs that were once living in these lakes. And so that's kind of a brutal example of introduced species. One of the classic introduced species, if you live in the South, you'd be able to identify this with this immediately. It's this plant that came from Japan called Kudzu. This Kudzu is just growing like crazy. It grows really quickly and it outcompetes all the normal vegetation. It grows so fast that it's just literally like total weed. It grows all over the place on the side of the road, and what it does is it's literally like choking out the natural vegetation because it's blocking the sunlight. And so it just can't be stopped. It's like you can't cut it back, it'll grow. You can't poison it because it'll hurt other vegetation. It's just simply, there's no natural predator for it, and so it's just out of hand. And so if you can see this link on YouTube, you're welcome to like grab that and take a look at the video, or literally like type in Kudzu and you could like watch this cool video on Kudzu if you're really interested in that. I want to show you though something that's kind of interesting related to introduced species is on the Galapagos Islands. People think of the Galapagos Islands a lot because of Charles Darwin and the theory of natural selection, and we think that these islands are just out there and they're very remote. They are, but there's a tremendous amount of tourism on the Galapagos Islands, and there's actually people living on the Galapagos Islands, and sadly, again, the tourism and all the people that arrive on the Galapagos, they're bringing species that don't belong, and so they're introducing them, and these species are threatening the organisms that live there. Take a look at this video. I think you'll enjoy it.
The islands of Galapagos, located about 600 miles west of Ecuador, are famous for their unspoiled beauty and unusual animal life. Creatures like giant tortoises, flightless cormorants, and swimming marine iguanas evolved in relative isolation here. But these conditions have changed dramatically on several islands of Galapagos in recent years. Today, more than 15,000 people are permitted to live in designated areas. Daily flights arrive carrying visitors eager to explore the untouched land. While people bring money used to preserve the island's natural state, they also introduce other items that harm its fragile ecology. Paleontologist Dr. David Steadman explains.
Even in a place seemingly as remote as Galapagos, there are more than 50,000 tourists a year coming out here. So the beach we're sitting on, boy, what a wonderful beach. It looks great. And within a 50-foot radius of us here, you could pick up 1,000 pieces of garbage. Now, garbage in itself maybe doesn't cause extinction, but nevertheless, it represents a type of human impact.
Today, the biggest threat to native populations come from introduced species. Dogs and cats, farm animals, and rats arrived on ships over the years.
When they get on islands, they're just cut loose. There's virtually no check on their populations, so their numbers grow rapidly, and they have devastating effects on the vegetation. They also have a devastating effect on animal populations.
One population especially threatened is the giant tortoise. In an effort to protect them, wardens from the national park dig up their eggs as soon as they are laid and bring them to the Charles Darwin station. Here, they are supervised and kept out of harm's way until the tortoises are big enough to survive on their own.
These are 3-year-old tortoises from the island of Santiago. Santiago is an island that has a lot of problems with introduced species, and so even though there's a wild population of tortoises there that in fact can lay eggs in the wild, the eggs are eaten especially by rats and pigs.
Once the tortoises hatch, they are raised here until they are 4 or 5 years old.
By 1 year old, these tortoises are sort of rat proof. So a rat can't hurt a tortoise after it's about a year old. But on Santiago, with all the feral pigs they have thousands of feral pigs on Santiago. The tortoises, these poor little baby tortoises, need to be about 4 or 5 years old before they're pig proof. So this is a good example of very active hands-on manipulation of a wild population in order to keep it going.
When new organisms are introduced into an existing ecosystem, they create different, sometimes harmful links in the food web. Often, with added competition, native species cannot survive. Scientists like David Stedman monitor places that are changing in an effort to influence the chain of events and protect the natural environment.
So I hope you enjoyed that. The message that I get from that is, there's a couple of ways that you could go about studying this. I mean, one thing is awareness to the fact that introduced species are an issue, but you could study them like a scientist would study them, and I'm hoping that you'd be interested in that. But you can also volunteer. You can go to Galapagos Islands and you can actually protect those eggs by working in those nurseries to protect them from those rats and pigs and dogs. But you're like, well, I don't know if I want to go to the Galapagos Islands or something like this. But again, you could do that locally. Investigate it. It's a call. It's a calling. We got to step it up. Like, what's happening locally in terms of invasive introduced species, and what can we do to protect the local habitat from this? And so one example of what can be done is we were noticing that there's this invasive weed that was growing in California by the Klamath River, and it came to be known as the Klamath weed, but really its origin is from Europe, and it was known as St. John's wort. And again, it was growing out of control, and so there was nothing that was keeping it in check. And so what we had to do is scientists from the University of California, Davis, researched this, and they discovered that there's this beetle that sort of eats it. And so we went and got that beetle and started putting it into the Klamath weed as a biological control. And so how do you like this? It's sort of fighting fire with fire, and you might think that there's some concern about this when you're introducing something and it's causing a problem, and then you're introducing something else in order to control it, and that can get out of hand too. When you're trying to manage nature, it's more difficult than it sounds. But I just wanted to point that out, that one way to combat this is to fight it with another introduced predator. So another concern is pollution. And again, that video that we were watching just a second ago introduced the fact that tourists sometimes bring pollution and things to the habitat which hurt it. But more often than not, it's like factories produce a lot of pollution. And so factories like oil refineries and such in industry produce some sulfur dioxides and nitrogen containing compounds that can produce sulfuric acid and nitric acid, and it can cause acid precipitation. But sometimes this airborne pollution, these chemicals, you're like, well, it's only going to hurt it locally. But no, when there's winds that can blow these pollutants across the Central Valley, and they actually will hit the western slope of the Sierra, and as a result will actually run down in the water when it rains. And so it actually enters into our most pristine environments. Sequoia National Park, Yosemite National Park. And so would you believe that the Tuolumne River, which is the main source of water for the Bay Area, the Tuolumne River and Merced River, the acidity is increasing as a result of this, of pollution. And so you could monitor this by checking this. You can check the pH, but you could also see what the effects are in the organisms that are living there. So at the base of the food chain, what these students are doing is they're picking up these rocks and then rubbing their hands on them And then this student has a net and they're collecting them. These are called macro invertebrates, which are, it's a little funny because they're really small little bugs and larvae. And so what happens is some of these organisms are more or less sensitive to pollutants. And if you, by determining and counting those populations, you can determine just how well the river is doing. It's sort of called biomonitoring, biostream monitoring. It's very interesting. And you can sort of determine, and you're like, well, who cares about the bugs? Well, the fish eat the bugs, and then the fish. And so we're really talking about the whole measure of the quality of the river. This is kind of sad too. Again, all of these, I hope you're looking at this in terms of human population is causing this. And so overexploitation. We have a tendency to overharvest things that we really like. And of course, salmon is a classic example of that, that we've devastated these salmon fisheries as well as other major fisheries. Again, this is a topic that would come up in environmental science and in marine biology, but some examples is that this bluefin tuna, I mean, we just love it, but we loved it to a point where we've overharvested it and it's endangered now. And then things like the African elephant, so brutal. You can tell it's an African elephant because its ears are shaped like Africa. But we're murdering these elephants for their tusks, for the ivory. It's unthinkable. And so what happens is you're like, well, we'll just stop. We'll stop hurting the elephant, and the population will come back, or the tuna will come back. Don't worry about it too much. Here's the problem. When the population becomes very, very small, what happens? What go too fast? Studies have shown that when a population is very small, they start to inbreed with one another. And when the inbreeding could possibly lead to recessive traits manifesting. And then, as a result of that, you lose genetic variability and you get the same organisms breeding with family members. And so there's higher incidence of troubled genes appearing in the gene pool. And then again, when a population is cut down by hunting, you're not cutting the population down and saving only the best, the most adapted organism. You're randomly destroying the population. And so what you can get is just a small group of pitiful, just saying, organisms that when they're bred back up lead to trouble. And so the population tends to have a higher mortality rate because maybe it's not looking good, which then leads to lower reproduction, which then causes a decline in the population. And so what conservation biologists call this is an extinction vortex. Once the population number gets down low enough, it's not going to be able to come back because of the loss of genetic diversity and the factors that I was discussing. And so sort of like, what are you going to do about it? So, when you're concerned about a population that's declining, you have to take a systematic approach because this is a science. So you have to confirm that the species in decline was once formerly abundant. So you have to do some population counts. And then you have to study the natural history. Like, what's the story with that organism? What are its demographic aspects? Like, how long does it live? How many males? How many females? What are its special environmental requirements? It takes a long time to study this. And so what are the possible reasons for decline? Is it habitat destruction? Is it introduced species? And then you come up with a hypothesis. Well, what can we do? If we restore this, if we stop this, if we do this, then what would happen? And then you have to go out and try it. And then if something's working, then maybe a new management policy comes into play. And so an example of this is this. It's a classic in the southwest United States. There's this woodpecker called the Red-Cockaded Woodpecker, and so it was once really, really, really prominent because of the forests that were once in the south. But a lot of that has been cut back now. It's been reduced, almost all of it actually. And so it's on the endangered list, and it's really sad, this woodpecker. And so as it turns out that the reason that it's declining because its habitat is destroyed, but it also has some interesting behaviors too. And so it's not as simple as it may seem. Like, for example, what's happening is its behavior, the bird itself, when it flies from nest to nest, as it turns out, it likes to fly very low. And as a result of that, if there's a lot of fire suppression and there's a lot of low understory, a lot of lower trees, it's not able to go from nest to nest, and so it's really sensitive. And so what conservation biologists do is they come into the area and test that hypothesis. So they burn this sort of understory back, and then they see if the woodpecker is able to manage in this area. And so just lastly, this is the last discussion here, and then I'm going to show you a little video to finish the video. And so when you're conserving species, it's sort of a balance. You have to weigh the demands. Like, for example, real popular species like redwoods are easy to sort of want to save because they're so iconic, like polar bears and panda bears and redwood trees. But in so doing, and save whales, but it sort of calls the attention to other less known ones, and so it's important to do that. But you have to weigh in the questions about human habitat. Like, we could say we want to save the gray wolves in Wyoming, but what about the people who are living in Wyoming and their families are endangered by these wolves? And then again, maybe we seek out the organisms to save because of their important role. If they're a critical keystone organism, then maybe that's worth saving as well. And so I just wanted to bring that to your attention. And so I want to conclude with a little conversation from the Howard Hughes Medical Institute about those woodpeckers. And so this is a panel of scientists that the Howard Hughes Medical Institute assembled to talk about biodiversity. And one of my favorite scientists, actually two of them, Bonnie Bassler and E.O. Wilson, were on this panel. It's really good. And so E.O. Wilson is addressing this student question from the audience about woodpeckers. I thought you might want to see it to finish the video.
A lot of species are really persnickety about their environments, which is why a lot of species are sensitive or endangered or extinct. For example, in Virginia, the red-cockaded woodpecker lives only in living longleaf pine ecosystems, and the red-cockaded woodpecker is basically a species that doesn't really have that much medical potential and isn't the primary food source or for any species or anything. So should current non-longleaf pine ecosystems such as mixed deciduous forests be converted to longleaf pines to aid the survival of this one species when longleaf pines are homes to only a few species and deciduous forests are homes to over 100 species?
I can answer that. Because I am right now involved deeply in that woodpecker in that forest.
Yes.
We're talking about the red-cockaded woodpecker, which is an endangered species, and once was found from the Carolinas to Texas in the longleaf pine savanna forest, which was covered 60% of the southern United States. And between the Civil War and the turn of the last century, we cut it all down. So there was less than 1% of old growth, original old growth left. The red-cockaded woodpecker depended on old growth, longleaf pine, to nest. And so it went down. It almost became extinct, just as the ivory-bill woodpecker became extinct in 1944 when we had cut down all of its trees that it needed, which were old-growth cypress and a few other giant trees in the floodplain forests, the swamps of the South. We lost that one. We're not going to lose the red-cockaded woodpecker, and there's not a trade-off, quite the opposite, because in addition to the red-cockaded woodpecker, dependent on that once great ecosystem is a large assemblage of other species of birds, of amphibians, of snakes, of insects, countless ones, and so on, that will go extinct if we continue to wipe it all out.
So I hope you enjoyed that introduction to the study of conservation biology. Thanks for watching.